So let me start by asking a question. How many of you are familiar with this case at all? Right, show of hands. How many of you attended the trial? A few, okay. How many knew some of the witnesses? Okay. How many of you have fished before? Okay, because this is kind of about fishing. Okay, let me get started. Let me set the scene because I think it's important to think about this time more than 30 years ago. Craig, Alaska, September of 1982. It was Labor Day weekend. We're talking about a Sunday. Can you hear me? That's better. Yeah, got to be heard. We're talking about a Sunday. It's really pretty much the last day of the season. There's one more opening. Craig is overrun with 18 and 19-year-old males who are drinking because they're happy to be done and they're getting paid. And a guy named Mark Colthurst, who owns the fishing boat, The Investor, is in town. He really hadn't spent that much time in Craig. He was really fishing out of Petersburg. Had a contract to deliver fish there. And so one of the boats of those 144 was this boat, The Investor. At the time, it was considered to be a Cadillac of fishing boats. It was quite expensive. This is just for the boat, the $750,000. So when you add the power skiff and the nets and all that other stuff, it gets closer to $1 million boat. And of course, that raised some questions because Mark Colthurst was all of 27 years old. What's a 27-year-old kid doing with $1 million boat? And so, of course, there's some little bit of jealousy. And he's from Washington State, and he's up here fishing in Alaska, and that is a thread that will develop through this story. And he fished a lot because he got an actual loan to get this boat, and so he had contracts. He started fishing. He did herring row. He went all the way out to Togiak to do herring. Did gill netting in Prince William Sound. So I think I added up the nautical miles is something over like 6,000. So when you think of commuting to work, that was pretty much the ultimate commute. And of course, with all that fishing, you get into town and you're a little tired, maybe, because you've probably worked hard. I've been fishing myself. Not for me. Thank you very much, but it's tiring, right? And the fish you can get them and you can't get them every single day. So you work hard. So where is The Investor? This is a map of Craig, close to what it was in 1982. The Investor is the farthest boat out on the North Dock. And it's rafted up actually next to the Defiant and the Decade. Behind it is the Libier, which we talked about, and that's the model. So that's directly behind the Investor. That's the boat that John Kenneth Peale was on. And the Cindy Sue, interestingly enough, is skippered by the father of the guy who was skippering the Libier, the Demert family. Mark and his wife, it was Mark's 28th birthday, and they were going to celebrate that night, and they went to the best restaurant in Craig, which is no longer there, by the way. It burned down a few years ago, which is Ruth Ann's. And it's about, if you have kids, it's probably about a half-hour walk because they had 2 kids. But it's about 15 minutes from the dock to Ruth Ann's. So they went and they had dinner. People noticed at the restaurant that there was some kind of dispute with somebody, maybe. They don't know remember who that person was. A waitress remembers that somebody was in her way when she was clearing the table. So that's another thread that kind of develops as the court case goes forward. Maybe there was some kind of fight with somebody. Okay. The next day, now we're on September 6th. The investor moves, and it moves from Craig, and you can see Craig down there, out to Ben's Cove. It's about 1.5 miles away. And how do we know this? Well, somebody on the Defiant, the boat that was rafted up next to it, was up at about 6 o'clock in the morning, ridding his stomach of last night's drinking. And so he saw the investor pull out at about 6 o'clock in the morning. And he waved to whoever was in the wheelhouse. And what was unusual was the investor left its tie lines behind, which is not something you would do. And they actually tried to get a hold of the investor, and no response. And in fact, as they headed out to the fishing grounds on this Monday, because the next opening was on Tuesday, they tried to radio, and again, no response. The next day, the investor was on fire. Now, what's interesting here, and this comes out, thankfully, from the records in the archive, a little bit in the trial, of course, whoever committed the murders had taken the boat out to Fish Egg Island. Probably the murders occurred on Sunday night, Monday morning. Monday, the boat's taken out. And what we learn is that whoever took the boat out there, probably with the entire family killed, we'll see, tried to sink the vessel. And so some people saw that person coming back to Craig in the skiff. Do you all know what a skiff is? Skiff, right? And you can see the back of the investor had a pretty fancy ramp for the skiff. And in fact, they noticed some damage to that ramp when they did the investigation on the boat. So that person, whoever did it, that perpetrator, went out, took the boat out, tried to sink it, came back to Craig, returned to Fish Egg Island because it hadn't sunk. So obviously there's our witnesses who, I shouldn't say obviously, there were witnesses who saw this person in that skiff over those 2 days. Sort of a detail of the fire. It was a fiberglass boat. It was a Delta boat. They're pretty much built as a cookie cutter. So all the designs are the same. Fiberglass, when it gets going, really burns hot. And one of the problems that arose here was they had a lot of trouble putting out that fire. Because Craig Police Department was kind of brand new, and they didn't have a fireboat. And none of the other boats who came to the scene wanted to even get close to it because it was burning so hot. And they didn't want to risk like the propane tanks on their own vessels. And so there was a number of creative attempts. A tug came and pushed it closer to shore. That didn't really help. They ended up getting some pumps from Ketchikan. They flew them up on a helicopter. That helped a little bit. And sometime later this day, they finally got the fire tamped down enough to get on board the vessel. Now, the state trooper who was on the scene, there's only one state trooper on the whole of Prince of Wales Island at this time. Initial thought was, this is a brand new fancy boat. And I'm betting that this guy didn't make any money and he's torching his boat for the insurance money. And he got on board the vessel and they're doing the investigation. There's lots of hot spots. The fiberglass is collapsing and they find a body. Then they find a second body. And of course, everything changed. And it's changed so much, in fact, that he had to use very, how do I want to put this, very concise language when he made the call to the Coast Guard for found permission to proceed. That's all he could say, because he didn't want to blast this over the radio waves and have everybody else, start outguessing him. By the time he was finished with his investigation, and it was preliminary because he knew he had called his boss in Ketchikan that the investigators were on their way, it was midnight. His first call came in at 4 o'clock. So it was a long day. It was starting to rain. It never rains in Southeast, I know, but anyway. And as a consequence, this is kind of one of the first, I'll say, mistakes in the investigation, because there was this evidence on shore. This is what it looked like the next day. You can see that's a pretty devastating crime scene. But there was also the skiff, which was in Craig, and he failed to fingerprint it. It was late. It was midnight. Okay, it's just a dumb skiff. I don't know what it is. And, of course, that's another thread that winds through the trial. I'm not a super fan of fingerprints. They're often, it's hard to get a good one, but nevertheless, probably something that should have been done. The troopers that got here were a different, so I should say here, the troopers who were on this scene investigation were assigned totally to this site. There was another group of troopers on shore in Craig, because remember that dock that I pointed out, that's probably where the murders occurred. So you had a scene investigation in Craig, and you had a scene investigation here, which is 1.5 miles away. Here, they're literally shoveling through the muck. They're looking for anything they can find. It's backbreaking work. You can't let anything pass. They were using shrimp screens to make sure they caught everything. And really, by the time they're finished, some bones, some teeth. That's a theme, again, we're going to get back to, because it's actually a through thread that turns out to be fairly important. So here's the family. Mark Coulter's 27, his wife Irene, his daughter Kimberly, age 5, his son Johnny, age 4. The point of them fishing this particular year, and the point of their boat, was that Mark and his wife Irene both missed having their family aboard. So they designed, it was a limit seiner, all the modern conveniences. Okay, 1982, and it was designed for Irene and the kids to be on board the vessel during the salmon season. When the investigation started, they weren't sure where the family was. They thought, in fact, the plan was for Irene and the kids to go back to Blaine, Washington, so that Kimberly could start school. And a quote from Mark Coulter's mom, "We got a call, the boat's on fire." And she said, Mark doesn't even know it. We know before he does. They're on their way back home. Of course, the next call they got was, it's a little worse than just the boat on fire. Not a call anybody wants to take. There were also 4 crewmen, all of them 18 or 19 years old. Michael Stewart, of course, was Mark's cousin. He lived on an island just off of Blaine, the Lummi Island. Dean Moon, he was 19. Dean at this time was running the skiff, which is, of course, a very important job. When you're purse seining, that's at least half of your money is dependent on how good your skiffman is. Just been promoted to that job. Jerome Cowan was a high school friend of Dean, and Jerome got the job because one of the other crew members, who I'll introduce you to in a minute, had left the boat. We'll get to that too. And then Chris Heyman. Chris Heyman had only been on the boat about a week. So, kind of some flux. That's another thread that kind of moves through this case and the investigation. Because Dean Moon's body was never found. He was only identified by a tooth at the second trial up in Juneau. Okay? One tooth. One tooth, by the way, that the defense said that's not his tooth, of course. Chris Heyman was eventually identified, and he was identified before Dean, but Dean's became a suspect. And one of the reasons he became a suspect because these other two crew members, when they left the boat, they were leaving the boat because there were some issues, there were some arguments, there were some disagreements, there was some discomfort with having Mark's wife and kids on board the vessel. And in fact, during the first year of the investigation, somebody claimed to have seen Dean Moon alive in San Francisco. So the troopers, of course, had to go down to San Francisco and figure out, is this really Dean Moon? And then they interviewed someone else that said, that wasn't Dean Moon, that was some grubby sailor. So always kind of a contention, really until the very end of the trial. Johnny Colthurst, age 4, his body was never found. No evidence of him at all. Again, remember that fire, remember that boat, how long it burned. So in a way, it became a crematorium. Tough case. Now I'm going to introduce you to two other people. Leroy Fleming, retired U.S. Customs officer. He was brought on board because the previous year, Mark Colthurst, on his previous boat, there was a guy in there selling marijuana. And with his new boat and $750,000, he was very serious about fishing, and he didn't want any of that surrounding him. And he said, if I get a U.S. Customs guy working for me, I think everybody will get the idea. Okay? Leroy left because he said, I'm older and I just don't like having kids around kicking them, and I'm afraid. So he left the boat about a month before the killings. Roy Tussing left about 1 week before the killings. And I can tell you, having interviewed him extensively, he has a fair share of survivor's guilt. He left because he was in a dispute with Mark about some repairs that the boat needed, and Mark was in a hurry to get them repaired, and Roy said, look, this is going to take way more time than you think. So, again, early on, these guys were kind of suspects too, right? You guys left. Why? What's going on here? There was some other investigations. Some suspects identified. One of them, in fact, was John Peel early on in this case. But they sent 2 witnesses in, and both of them went into the Hill bar and said, sorry. So the trooper in charge of the on-scene investigation said, negative. John Peel, negative. The other error here was, you see these composites, police composites. Those weren't actually done for several days into the investigation. Okay? And we're already, remember, 2 days, when the fire occurs, we're already 2 days after the murder. So now we're probably 3, 4, 5 days before these were done. In fact, Jerry Mackey didn't see these. He was looking for somebody that looked kind of like him. So after about a year, the troopers were stuck. They had about 12 or so suspects that they had interviewed. They went all the way to Indiana because somebody came up with this fantastic story that seemed to know a lot. And they went to Indiana, and then they discovered a True Detective magazine under his sofa, and he was just making stuff up based on that story. This happens a lot with big crimes. You know, there's somebody that's got this incredible story. And they had what they call an anniversary meeting, and they put up a matrix. And one of the guys that was key in that matrix was a guy named Glenn Floethy, who was also the key guy in solving the Robert Hansen serial murder cases in Anchorage. If he walked into the room, you think he's a rather tall teacher, right? Doesn't have sort of the typical, whatever a typical trooper looks like. I bet a lot, I don't know. At the end, there were two suspects. I mentioned Dean Moon, because they really hadn't found him, they couldn't account for him, and John Peel. It was another year, though, before there was an arrest. John Peel was arrested 2 years after the crime. But this case, and I mentioned some of the errors, largely was a circumstantial case, and the prosecution never put forward a motive. And the first jury in Ketchikan was divided. There were 7 jurors that said not guilty, 5 that said guilty. Mary Ann Henry, who you see here, really pared down her case. I think she had something like 96 witnesses in the first case. So the jury ended up sending a letter to the judge saying, like, we got to do something. You got to pay us more money. This is horrible. This is the worst experience of our lives. And we're losing money, right? Because it's a seasonal economy for a lot of them. You know, if they just went straight through fishing season, who cares? What are you catching? So 2 trials. Ultimately, John Peel was found not guilty on all of the charges. My belief is that somebody knows who done it. To this day, folks in Craig were very scared. They were locking their doors. It's a town of 500 people, and it's pretty isolated. If you've ever been to Craig, I mean, you have to want to go there. And I don't mean that derogatorily, although it came out that way. But I mean, it's a destination, man, right? I talked to somebody last night who worked on one of the lumber mills there, and she said it took her 5 hours to get to Craig, and she was only 30 miles away, because they're on logging roads and they have to go really slow. I don't want to go down that slope. So it was, it's remote. That's what anyway. So, still Alaska's worst unsolved murders. If you have questions, comments, let's have at it. I'm here for your questions. But please take the mic, right? Well, don't take the mic. And I do want to kind of have my acknowledgments. I started this research unbelievably in 1992, and the old state archives, Larry Hipsman, who worked there, and in fact Karen was there, offered to rent me a cot because I was there so much. And it was, I had to bring rolls of nickels because I had to get the stuff out of there and go to the machine and make copies, and it was really, but it was fun. It was. And when I complained that there was so much material, Larry said, you should see what we got on the Exxon Valdez. So yes.
Can you talk about the second trial at all?
So the second trial was really a pared down version of the first trial. So it was not as many witnesses. There was a few surprise witnesses that kind of failed spectacularly for the prosecution, because the whole issue of you're getting some leniency for testifying today. Aren't you in a little bit of trouble? Which, that doesn't ever go over very well. And then the prosecution. The defense, didn't present a case. Just said done, which surprised everyone. It even surprised John Peel. They'd warned him. They told him they were going to do that. But there was gasps in the room. You're not presenting. No, there's nothing here. Yes.
Can you elaborate a bit about why John Kenneth Peel?
Why? Okay. John Kenneth Peel, when he was fishing on the Libby 8, had a really lousy season. It was a cannery boat. It broke down more often than it ran. They estimated he maybe fished 7 days, whereas the investor was fishing like, I don't know, 50, 60 days during that same season. So what happened was he had his wife, and this is in the court record, so I'm not speaking out of turn, send him some marijuana to sell. And so he was essentially selling marijuana in Craig. And so there's some sense that some of his behavior, at least the defense theory of the case, was his behavior that looked suspicious to the cops because he was very evasive. His stories were inconsistent. They caught him in lies. But the defense theory was, because he was selling pot and he didn't want to get busted for that. He knew the Colthursts. He'd worked for Mark Colthurst on his previous boat. Roy Tussing, who had quit only the week before, had worked for Mark for 8 years, said that of John Peel, that he didn't like to share of his work so freely as the rest of us, which is a very nice way of saying he was lazy. And again, remember they had the U.S. Customs guy. John Peel was a big pot smoker. And so, Mark didn't want that, and he had fired John Peel. Although, again, there's another version that says he wasn't fired, he quit. As we used to say where I used to work, did he jump or was he pushed? But so there was a lot of issues, and the thing is, when there's a truism in police work, if you lie on a murder investigation, you're making yourself a suspect. And John Peel was lying a lot. I'd also say that, go ahead.
I know someone who was very intimately involved in the investigation. He was quite bitter about the way the trial turned out because of the evidence that could not be submitted that he felt was conclusive. Were you able to see that evidence that had not been?
So the backstory is when the second trial ended, Marianne Henry went to Judge Carpenetti and she wanted the entire record to be preserved here at the archive. Access to that at this point is restricted. However, I snuck under the wire, and yes, I did get to look at the only thing I couldn't look at were medical records, obviously for good reason. It's with all of that. I mean, I've been like this, but I will still say it's a weak case. It's a circumstantial case, and there was 500 other possible suspects in Craig, and the on-scene investigation in Craig was not good. And I've talked to a number of troopers who agree with me on that. In fact, that's the sense that there were some mistakes made on shore. There was one mistake made, obviously, with the skiff, but the on-scene investigation on the investor was meticulous. Quite contrast. There was a fight, in fact, an argument between those two teams as to who would be in charge. So that didn't help either. Yes.
Could you explain why there were two trials? Was the first one declared a mistrial?
Yes.
Okay.
And then, here's a little tidbit. How many of you know why the trial was moved to Juneau? None?
Too much familiarity with the case and catch a game.
Well, so they, yeah, yeah. Actually, what really happened was Judge Schultz, who was the trial judge in Ketchikan, his law clerk became romantically involved with the defense attorney. Okay? I'm not kidding. And so, like, so the judicial canons were kind of in flex right there. Because, of course, the implication is the defense attorney now knows everything the judge was thinking. Now, the judge was very proper, and he was mad as hell about that. And he fought it, but he lost. And then the next thing comes, well, then there's going to be a change of venue. And it was interesting because the defense attorney did not want it in Ketchikan because he felt like John Kenneth Peel could not get a fair trial in Ketchikan. When this came up, no, we should stay in Ketchikan, and it was actually the prosecution who wanted to move it to Juneau. And they, by the way, the attendance in the courtroom in Ketchikan is not even half the size of this room. And it was full every single day. So when they came to Juneau, they said, we're going to need a big courtroom. And so they picked, it was in the federal courthouse, right? Big courtroom. Well, there was a lot of crowds for the first couple of days. And then Juneau goes, I don't know. We don't know in this case. And so there wasn't really a lot of attendance after the first, until the end, when the final arguments went in. I guess I'll give you one more tidbit, which is kind of fun. The first trial judge, Judge Schultz, happened to be in town in Juneau when the final arguments were being made. And he happened to go and sit in. And the trial, I mean, he was just as a spectator like anyone else. And he said to him, it just symbolized the whole trial, because here's the defense attorney by himself making the argument for John Kenneth Peel. And on the other side were 3 or 4 attorneys. And of course it was like, that's the state. Here's this defense attorney, the lone guy, and he said, and they were still fighting and they were still arguing like they did the whole time that I was the judge. There was lots of fines. There was lots of bitter words shared between the two sides. They didn't trust each other, either of the attorneys. In fact, let me go back here because Lori told me I can't, but I do have to show you this picture. See the body language between the two attorneys? I mean, isn't it like Marianne Henry? If she could lean any farther, she would be out of the photo. Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is one of the great shots of all time. This is taken by a guy named Hall Anderson, the Ketchikan newspaper.
Was Widener a public defender?
No, he took this case on because he is known as a bulldog who would fight for every last scrap, and a real fighter. And he was a big fan of the underdog. I just met someone who worked for him after this case, and an attorney, and she said that this trial bankrupted him because his practice was in Anchorage, and he had to come down to Juneau and catch a
Did he do both trials? He did both?
Yes, both trials.
And I have a second question.
It's okay.
What was the John Kenneth Peel story after the second trial? Like, where did he land in this world? And he was so notorious.
Well, so John Kenneth Peel had some troubles. He and his attorney sued the state of Alaska and the city of Bellingham for $177 million. So, but they got him about $1 million. And he bought a house. He and his wife bought a house. He was divorced within a year. She got the house. He had a sort of a series of problems with drugs. In fact, the brother of one of the victims, Jerome Cowan, his older brother was a pharmacist, and John Peel tried to present a fake prescription to the pharmacy that that Brian Cowan worked at. Brian wasn't there, but they chased him down and tackled him. He's since, kind of reformed his act. He's working as a welder at the Ferndale refinery up near Blaine, between Bellingham and Blaine.
So I understand that the fire was very hot, but was the coroner ever able to determine the cause of death or any circumstantial evidence?
So they know that Mark Coulter's and Irene Coulter's were shot. They had head wounds from a .22. They did recover rifles on various vessels and had them tested. And the FBI came back and said, yeah, it could have been, but then there's about 1,000 other rifles that could have been them too. And that's kind of always one of the tough questions, right? How do you kill 8 people with a .22? Well, part of it is the time of year, right? And they did find alcohol, past drunk alcohol levels in the victims they found, and the coroner found. They did find gunshot wounds in several, but they didn't have intact bodies for all of them. But the boat itself, as fancy as it was, once you're down below in the forecastle, there's really no way out except for through the galley, and that's where the killer stood. So they were trapped. There's a vent in the front, but the Roy Tussing said, I had a constant battle trying to keep that vent open. Everybody just kept closing. He said they probably forgot. But they were trapped. That's my theory. I talked to someone last night who has a different theory, who was a journalist on the scene for a couple of years, so he and I will continue to argue about that. But any other questions? Yes.
I can project. I hope that's okay.
This is being recorded, so you've got to be able to project.
So I covered the second trial for the Juneau Empire and the Bellingham Herald.
Oh,
Talk.
my thanks to you. I stole every word you wrote.
A lot of it was stretched. I was also doing the arts and entertainment section then, I think. But anyway, small newspapers. But during the process of the trial and researching later for a follow-up story 10 years after, I talked to a couple jurors from both cases and people involved with it from all over the place. And basically, there was a general agreement that the state could not make its case, that it was so screwed up, the investigation. You burn up all the evidence, that hurts. Then you wash that evidence into the ocean, that hurts. But a couple people, when I say, well, do you think Peel did it? Because there were a lot of people, including family of the victims, who thought they were. And the answer I got from a couple of them was he could have, which was interesting. Wasn't that they were going to vote for conviction, but they felt like he could have, which is not a term of justice. In all the research you did, because this was a long time ago, did you ever get the feeling that he got off simply because he had good defense and there wasn't a lot of the case, but he could have actually done it?
I don't know. I don't. I say I go back and forth. I'm not trying to be cute, but
No.
You ended up, if you're gonna, my sense of building a case, and and my example, of course, is the the Robert Hansen case in Anchorage. You want a strong base of evidence, and then you just kind of build, and it ends up kind of in a pyramid at the top. This is the person. In this case, the pyramid was upside down, and so it's like, well, who's left? Which is not really a great way to build a case. And so ultimately, I went over and over his interview at Bellingham when he took the lie detector test, and I read it. I read the portion that the jury did not see, because there's a transcript of that 4 minutes that was left out. Even then, like, oh, God, he sounds, I don't know. And so he coulda, but when this is your case, let it, could be somebody else.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. You've been a great audience. Great questions. Great questions. Oh, this one. So, by the way, how many yards?
We have 37 cubic feet.
37 cubic feet. Do you think there's 37 cubic feet worth of information in here? There is not. But what I'm doing, thanks to the internets, I'm taking excerpts of stuff that ended up on the factory floor, as it were, or the cutting room floor, and putting them in my blog. So, for example, one of the things I'll talk about here in the coming days and months and weeks are some of the other suspects, because there were more than a few. In fact, when I was working with the state trooper, when I started this book, I worked with him, Walter Gilmore, on Butcher Baker. He was absolutely convinced that there was somebody else, and he knew who it was, but he wouldn't say his name, because I was supposed to figure it out, because I'm the smart guy. You're the cop. I know, but anyway, there were a lot of other suspects, and not just the crazy one that had True Detective under his, although that's a fun one to write about. There was also, there was the drug boat rumors. I took a call a couple years ago from someone in England who'd heard that the Latin mafia was involved. And I said, no, it was the Canadian mafia. Not quite the same. Doesn't have the same ring, does it? So there's a rich sort of background of who it could have been, and I'll explore more of that in the coming months and years. And thank you so much.